Winfield Scott was a United States Army general, and unsuccessful presidential candidate of the Whig Party in 1852. Known as Old Fuss and Feathers, and the Grand Old Man of the Army, he served on active duty as a general longer than any other man in American history, and many historians rate him the best American commander of his time. Over the course of his 53-year career, he commanded forces in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Mexican-American War, the Second Seminole War, and, briefly, the American Civil War, conceiving the Union strategy known as the Anaconda Plan that would be used to defeat the Confederacy. He served as commanding general of the United States Army for 20 years, longer than any other holder of the office. A national hero after the Mexican-American War, he served as military governor of Mexico City. Such was his stature that, in 1852, the United States Whig Party passed over its own incumbent President of the United States, Millard Fillmore, to nominate Scott in that year's United States presidential election. At a height of 6 feet 5 inches, he remains the tallest man ever nominated by a major party. Scott lost to Democrat Franklin Pierce in the general election, but remained a popular national figure, receiving a brevet promotion in 1855 to the rank of lieutenant general, becoming the first American since George Washington to hold that rank. Early years. Winfield Scott was born to William Scott and Anna Mason on Laurel Branch, the family plantation in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, near Petersburg, Virginia, on June 13, 1786. He briefly attended the College of William and Mary, studied law in the office of a private attorney, and served as a Virginia militia cavalry corporal near Petersburg in 1807. Army captain. Scott's long career in the United States Army began when he was commissioned as a captain in the light artillery in May 1808, shortly before his 22nd birthday. Scott's early career in the Army was tumultuous. Scott openly criticized the then commanding general of the Army, James Wilkinson, over Wilkinson's refusal to follow orders and remove troops from an unhealthy bivouac site he owned near New Orleans, which caused several illnesses and deaths. Scott's commission was suspended for 1 year, and after returning to duty, he served in New Orleans on the staff of General Wade Hampton from 1811 to 1812. Scott earned the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers for his insistence on military bearing, courtesy, appearance and discipline. In his own campaigns after reaching high rank, Scott preferred to use a corps of Army regulars augmented by volunteers whenever possible. Scott perennially concerned himself with the welfare of his men, as demonstrated by his quarrel with Wilkinson over the New Orleans bivouac site. In another instance, when cholera broke out at a post under his command, Scott was the only officer who stayed to nurse the stricken enlisted men. War of 1812. Lieutenant Colonel at Queenston Heights. The Army promoted Scott to Lieutenant Colonel of the 2nd Artillery Regiment in July 1812. Scott served primarily on the Niagara Campaign front in the War of 1812. He took command of an American landing party during the Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812. Most New York militia members refused to cross into Canada in support of the invasion, and the British compelled New York militia commander Brigadier General William Wadsworth and Scott, the regular army commander, to surrender. The British held Scott as a prisoner of war. The British considered Irish American prisoners of war British subjects and traitors and executed 13 such Americans captured at Queenstown Heights. The British paroled and released Scott in a prisoner exchange. Upon release, Scott returned to Washington to pressure the Senate to take punitive action against British prisoners of war in retaliation for the British executions of Irish American soldiers. The Senate wrote a bill after this urging, but President James Madison believed the summary execution of prisoners of war unworthy of civilized nations and so refused to enforce the act. colonel at Fort George. Scott was promoted to colonel in March 1813. Scott planned and led the capture of Fort George, Ontario, on the Niagara River. By crossing the Niagara and landing on the Lake Ontario shore, Scott forced the British to abandon Fort George. Colonel Scott was wounded in this battle, which is considered among the best planned and executed U.S. operations of the war. Brigadier General at Chippewa and Lundy's Lane. Scott was promoted to Brigadier General on March 19, 1814. He was only 27 years old at the time, one of the youngest generals in the history of the U.S. Army. Scott commanded the 1st Brigade, and was instrumental in the decisive American success at the Battle of Chippewa on July 5, 1814. Scott had a major role in the bloody Battle of Lundy's Lane on July 25 and suffered serious wounds. The American commander, Major General Jacob Brown, and the British-Canadian commander, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, were also wounded. Brevet Major General for his valor at Lundy's Lane. Scott received a brevet to Major General to date from July 25, 1814. However, the severity of his wounds prevented his return to active duty for the remainder of the war. In 1815, Scott was admitted as an honorary member of the Pennsylvania Society of the Cincinnati in recognition of his service in the War of 1812. After War of 1812, Brigadier General Winfield Scott supervised the preparation of the first standard drill regulations for the Army and headed a post-war officer retention selection board in 1815. He also served as president of Board of Tactics in 1815. Scott visited Europe to study French military methods in 1815–1816. He translated several military manuals of Napoleon I of France into English. Scott held regional command in the Division of the North in 1816. He married Maria D. Mayo in 1817. Scott served as president of the Board of Tactics in 1821 and 1824. Scott commanded the Eastern Department in 1825. Scott again served as president of the Board of Tactics in 1826. The Army passed over Scott for Army command. In 1828, he resigned, but the Army refused his resignation. Scott again visited Europe and then resumed command of the Eastern Department in 1829. Upon direction of the War Department, Scott in 1830 published abstracts of infantry tactics, including exercises and maneuvers of light infantry and riflemen, for the use of the militia of the United States, for the use of the American militia. Nullification crisis. Cholera among his reinforcing troops prevented Scott from taking field command during the Black Hawk War. In late November and early December 1832, Scott organized U.S. Army troops for possible enforcement of President Andrew Jackson's authority during the nullification crisis. In late 1832 and early 1833, Scott served as an emissary from President Jackson to South Carolina. His tactful diplomacy and the use of his troops in suppressing a major fire in Charleston did much to defuse the crisis. Indian Wars. In 1832, Scott replaced John E. Wool as commander of federal troops in the Cherokee Nation lands in Georgia. Scott commanded the field forces in Second Seminole War and Creek War in 1836. Scott was recalled to Washington due to the highly politicized nature of the tactics he employed and the huge expenditures incurred in policing the frontier, compounded by controversies between regular army and local militia officers. Brigadier General Edmund Meredith Shackelford was appointed commander in the area by President Jackson until Brigadier General Thomas Jesup could arrive. A court of inquiry later cleared Scott of wrongdoing in the Seminole and Creek operations. Scott felt that his recall was a political intrigue. In 1845, Shackelford wrote to Jackson for a clarifying statement that Shackelford had had no part in Scott's recall to Washington. Scott assumed command of the Eastern Division in 1837. Scott was responsible for maintaining order on the Canadian border, where the Patriot War threatened to entangle the U.S. in the Upper Canada Rebellion. Cherokee removal. Presidents Jackson and Van Buren, ignoring the Supreme Court's ruling in Worcester v. Georgia, tacitly supported Georgia's expulsion of the Cherokees. In 1838, Scott was placed in charge of enforcing the Treaty of New Echota, including removal of the Cherokees to the Indian Territory. Van Buren put Scott in command of the Army of the Cherokee Nation, headquartered at Fort Cass and Fort Butler. Arriving at New Echota, Cherokee Nation, on April 6, 1838, Scott immediately divided the Cherokee Nation into 3 military districts. He designated May 26, 1838 as the beginning date for the first phase of the removal. The first phase involved the Cherokees in Georgia. Scott wanted Army regulars rather than Georgia militia for this operation, because the militia had personal gains at stake. Some claimed Cherokee land. The promised regulars did not arrive in time, so Scott proceeded with 4,000 Georgia militia. The moral implications of the Jackson-Van Buren policies did not make Scott's role easy. Representative John Quincy Adams opposed the removal, imputing it to Southern politicians and land grabbers. Many Americans agreed. Scott reassured the Cherokee people of proper treatment. In his instructions to the militia, Scott called any acts of harshness and cruelty abhorrent to the generous sympathies of the whole American people. Scott also admonished his troops not to fire on any fugitives they might apprehend unless they should make stand and resist. Scott detailed help to render the weak and infirm. Horses or ponies should be used to carry Cherokees too sick or feeble to march, also infants, superannuated persons, lunatics, and women in a helpless condition. With all in the removal deserve peculiar attention, which the brave and humane will seek to adopt to the necessities of the several cases. Scott's good intentions, however, did not adequately protect the Cherokees from terrible abuses, especially at the hands of lawless rabble that followed on the heels of the soldiers to loot and pillage. At the end of the first phase of the removal in August 1838, 3,000 Cherokees left Georgia and Tennessee by water toward Oklahoma, but camps still retained another 13,000. By the intercession of Chief John Ross in Washington, these Cherokees traveled under their own auspices, unarmed, and free of supervision by militiamen or regulars, though government contractors, steamboat owners, and others who stood to profit protested. Scott carried out this new policy. Ex-President Jackson demanded of the Attorney General the replacement of Scott and the arrest of Chief Ross. Within months, Scott captured every Cherokee in North Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama who could not escape. His troops reportedly rounded up the Cherokee and held them in rat-infested stockades with little food. Private John G. Burnett later wrote, "Future generations will read and condemn the act, and I do hope posterity will remember that private soldiers like myself, unlike the 4 Cherokees who were forced by General Scott to shoot an Indian chief and his children, had to execute the orders of our superiors. We had no choice in the matter." More than 4,000 Cherokee died in this confinement before ever beginning the trip west. As the first groups herded west died in huge numbers in the heat, the Cherokee pleaded with Scott to postpone the second phase of the removal until autumn, and he complied. Determined to accompany them as an observer, Scott left Athens, Georgia, on October 1, 1838 and traveled with the first company of 1,000 people, including both Cherokees and black slaves, as far as Nashville. The Cherokee removal later became known as the Trail of Tears. A ruse took war. When Brigadier General Winfield Scott reached Nashville, superiors abruptly ordered him to return to Washington to deal with troubles on the Canadian border. On this assignment, he helped diffuse tensions between officials of the state of Maine and the British colony of New Brunswick in the undeclared and bloodless Aroostook War in March 1839. In 1840, Scott wrote Infantry Tactics, or Rules for the Exercise and Maneuver of the United States Infantry. This three-volume work served as the standard drill manual for the United States Army until William J. Hardee's Tactics, published in 1855. Commanding General. On June 25, 1841, the Commanding General of the United States Army, Major General Alexander Macomb, died. As he was the senior ranking officer in the Army, Scott was the obvious choice to succeed Macomb. Scott assumed office as Commanding General on July 5, 1841 and was promoted to the rank of Major General, then the highest rank in the Army, with the date of rank of June 25, 1841. As Commanding General of the Army, Scott took great interest in the professional development of the cadets of the United States Military Academy.